Hey again. So in this module, we're going to talk about testing in Rider. And this is not a course on testing, so we're not going to talk about why you should test and the benefits of testing and unit tests versus integration tests. We're going to focus on the functionality in Rider around testing. And to demo this, let's create a new project. So let's go to File, New Solution, Class Library. Let's call it Shopping Cart Lib. And this can be just a .NET 9 class library. So typically in .NET, you'd create a new project for tests. So let's do new project. And down here, we're going to say unit tests. Let's call it shopping cart lib.tests. And again, .NET 9, everything else is fine, except for this dropdown, which defaults to NUnit. I always go with XUnit, so let's do that. And then create. So that's created our new project, and we've got an empty test class here. And you can see, and I think we've shown this before, we can see we've got some triangles here, play buttons, and then if you click on it, you can choose run, debug, cover, profile. We'll talk more about these later, but let's just do run. So that's now built the project and run this test. So if we go down here, this now introduces this pane, the test pane. So here is where you would get to it if you wanted to just click and open this pane, or Alt and 8. Again, if it's not here and you've not opened it, it's probably hidden in this ... menu. And you can see because the test has passed. Now in .NET, obviously there's nothing in it, but unless it explicitly fails an assert or throws an exception, then that's a test pass. If I say, let's do assert true, so that's a passing test. And I'm going to select this and do Control D for duplicate. Let's add another line there. And then call this test2 and then make this false. So now if I want to run both of these, I can either do it at this level, so that'll run all tests within this class, or I can literally just run all tests. So if we go down here, we can see we've got tabs along the top. So if I close this one that's just opened, we can see Explorer has all of the tests that have been discovered. And again, I can right click and say run and do all these things. Clicking here, I can run the selected test, or here runs them all. Now it says Control Alt and Enter, but that only applies if this has got focus. If I'm here and I want to run all the tests, for the key bindings I have, it's Control U and L. If I do Shift and do run all tests, it's this one, run all tests from solution. We can see it's Control U L. If yours is different, then maybe do Shift and find out what the mapping is here. So if I do Control U L now, then it's going to run all the tests. And we can see we've got red here now because obviously one of them has failed. And you can see here, we've got this. And with these buttons here, we can filter down. So if I only want to show failing tests, I can do that, which is useful if you've got a lot of tests and a few of them are failing and you want to work through and just show the failing ones and you want to work through fixing the failing ones until you've got them all passing. If you're doing that, then this button is quite useful. And that's rerun failed tests or Control UF. So that means that as you're trying to get all your tests passing, you can run this so that the ones that have already passed, you're not running those again. You're just focusing on the ones that have failed. If I untoggle that, then it's going to show them both again. If you do have a lot of tests, so you don't want to run them all every time, but you have a specific subset of tests that you want to run, then what you can do is you can say it was just this test one, for example, or even like a grouping. So you've got different scopes here. So you've got your tests, your test class, your namespace, your project. So I can right click somewhere and say create new session. And what that does is it opens up a new tab with just those tests in it. And I can pick and choose what tests are in this session. And I can even right click and say rename session to something else. So that does this box here. It's worth pointing out, we've already spoken about debugging, but when you go to run a test, you can also debug as well. So if I put a breakpoint here, for example, and then right click or click here or wherever and do debug, then it's hit the breakpoint. So everything we covered in the debugging module applies here. You can run a test and you can see there's no variables in scope here, but you'd see all the local variables. You can use the immediate window. You can view the call stack, basically everything we covered in the debugging module. So let's stop debugging here. So let's delete this block and let's start on our shopping basket. So let's create a new system under test is new shopping cart. And let's say this first test is new cart should be empty, something like that. And then let's say system under test, get should be equivalent to an empty list. So let's go with that. So obviously this is failing at the moment. It's not even compiling. So we're going to use Alt-Enter to create the type shopping cart. I'm now going to do Alt-Enter again, and I'm going to say move to shopping cart, so move to its own file. Then I'm going to, up here, I'm going to drag the shopping cart into our library, so it's not in the test project. And then we can see we've got a bit of yellow here, so Alt-Enter and Enter again, basically fix up the namespace. Okay, so if we go back to our test, now it still can't find it because our test project is not currently depending on our main project. So we're going to talk about dependencies later on in this course, but for now I'm going to right click here and say add a reference to the shopping cart project, add. So that's now found the reference. So the next issue we've got is that there's no method called get. So again, we're letting the failing test, and it's failing at the moment because it's not even compiling, drive our implementation. So Alt-Enter, and I can get Rider to create that method get. So just press enter, and it's created that for me. If I go back to my code, then it can't find this method. Now I actually use a NuGet package, and again, we're going to talk about NuGet packages later, but if I right click and say manage NuGet packages, for now, I use a library called Fluent Assertions for my asserts. So let's do that. Very popular library, I would highly recommend. And this gives a nice Fluent syntax, and I did this wrong, it's actually that. And if I do Alt-Enter to import the references, and it's still not showing, I've probably spelled that wrong, be equivalent to. Okay, so that's there. It's failing because shopping cart is returning an object, not something that's a list. So if I go back to here, that was control click, and then change this to what we want. We want a list. Let's call it a string. Let's keep it simple. Then we have this. So let's try and run our test. So we've got a failing test. It's failing because our implementation is not implemented exception. So now we've got a failing test. We can see here we want to get this to pass. So all I need to do is return an empty list at this point. So one shortcut at this point, which I use a lot, is Control U. So U is kind of the entry point into the testing shortcuts. A lot of the shortcuts revolve around Control U followed by another character, or somehow involve the U key. But Control U repeats the last test that you ran, or the last set of tests you ran. So the last one I did was these. So at this point, if I do Control U, it's rerun that, and now it's green. So in this video, we're not going to write any further tests. We're going to save that to the next video where we will expand on this. And we're going to talk about code coverage and running your tests continuously whilst you develop. Before I finish this video though, I just want to add a few extra tips. So one thing that's really useful is when you right click somewhere on a test or over here or somewhere, you've got this run unit test until fail. Now this is really handy for if you've got a flaky test, which maybe is failing sometimes based on timing. Maybe you've got some multi-threaded code or something and occasionally it fails. You can right click and say run test till it fails, or even better, debug unit test till it fails so that your debugger will catch it. Then go and get a coffee and come back and hopefully you'll have the fail case in your debugger. Another nice little tip, which I've only just discovered in the documentation, I didn't know this existed, was that if your test generates two files, you can get the UI to nicely show a diff. So for example, I won't actually demonstrate it, I'll just show the documentation, but this is highlighting a bit weird, but if I select this so we can read it, if you've got a test that outputs something that matches this regular expression, so for example down here, then this will specify two files, and then you get in the test output window a hyperlink in the output, which if you click, it will open up the diff of the two files in your editor window. So the split screen view. So I thought that was quite nice, so I thought that was worth mentioning. Speaking of this output window, I kind of brushed over that, didn't I? So let's have a look at this. So we've had passing tests, so this is kind of empty. If I make a change here to make it fail, let's just say blah, and Control U to run it again. So that's now going to fail. Then on this side, we've got a description of why it's failing. It's also worth pointing out that in your tests you can, so say I did console.writeLine, some log, something I want to log out. Now you can see how it's got this underline. That's because with XUnit it's recommended to use iTest output helper instead. So Rider can do that for me. So Alt enter, and it's changed it for me. It's created the constructor and it's injected it in. And actually we've got another suggestion, and this will be primary constructors. So let's do Alt enter, convert to primary constructor. I'm assuming at some point they'll update that to be just one pass rather than two, but at least you can follow those warnings and suggestions that Rider gives you. So if I run this again, so I can control UU or just right click here and then run unit test. It says shift and enter, so that's another option. We can go down here and shift and enter. So it's failing, and if I scroll down, then it's not there because I've put that after the failure. So let me just move that up to here. And again, I mentioned it earlier on in the course, I'm using a Vim plugin, which I'll talk about later. So me quickly moving that up was using Vim. If I undo that and just do it without using Vim. So I've used it that long, I forget I'm using it, but I didn't want to turn it off because when I'm watching videos of other people coding, I actually quite like to see how other people code day to day and what their tools and things are. So I intentionally haven't turned this off because this is just how I code. But I'll mention the idea Vim plugin later on in the course. So let's control UU again and scroll down, and now we do have it. So we can see that's logged it out. Some type of output. So you might have something failing. Maybe you're doing like an integration test and you've got some failure which doesn't appear down here, some logs that don't appear. What I recommend doing is if you put a breakpoint in your code or further down or wherever it is that's after what the log is that you'd expect to appear. Maybe it's an exception that's in some thread or something, and then you debug it. So I can click on here, I can right click and go here, or I can just do Control D. So because that failed, that's actually hit here. But because we're in the debugging view now, if you go to console here, then in my basic example, I've not actually got any normal output logs. That's not a test helper output. But if my code or the threads or whatever, or I was doing an integration test and there was something that wasn't appearing in my test output, this would be where I would go to look for more information. Because quite often I've found that this is where the clue is. And another thing we can do is when debugging, do you remember this breakpoint? I mentioned earlier that you could click this to stop on any exception. Sometimes if your test covers stuff again in another thread or it's an integration test or something, sometimes clicking this so the breakpoint stops on that exception and it doesn't skip past any handled exceptions, then sometimes that can be really useful as well, making sure that's turned on. So if your test failure isn't obvious, which for a small unit test it should always be, it should be quite a pure method call, but for integration tests it might not be, then making sure that's ticked when debugging the test is useful, and also just checking out the console output for more information. So that's a basic intro to the Rider test UI. In the next video, we're going to look at code coverage, but also continuous testing. So whilst you're coding, the tests are running in the background for you without you having to explicitly run your tests.